Welcome to the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. And if you joined us for the first part of this three-part series last week, you already know we're diving deep into 25 demographic trends for 2025. And today we're going to unpack even more insights that are going to impact how we live, how we work, how we're going to invest this year. And we're going to tackle some of the trends that are going to ripple through to if you're a business person, investor, an entrepreneur. So, Simon, you made some bold predictions last week. I'm going to make a prediction. This is going to be an interesting week in politics.
Yes, it is. We'll very soon be seeing President Trump start his second term. And that's one of those big, fat global events that everybody around the world would have been holding their breath on to see what will happen. And the waiting period, of course, realistically extends for a couple of months to see what is he going to do? How is this going to change? And that's what lots of people, lots of markets looked to. And so once we create a bit of certainty around what is happening what's the broad geopolitical direction of this year, then things will flow a bit more. So I would argue that the first half of this year is a bit of a hold still and steady and watch type period. And then we react as much more reactive and proactive second half of the year, roughly speaking. That's what tends to be the case when a presidential election took place.
Well, there's also going to be a federal election in Australia, and in our episode last week, you made a prediction of how our next Prime Minister is going to be. I'm not going to do a spoiler alert because if you're new to this podcast, why not subscribe wherever you're listening to this on your podcast app or on YouTube, and then go back to last week's podcast where Simon's made a number of predictions about the election and also given us some thoughts that migration has peaked, a bit about Australia's birth rates and unemployment. But Simon, let's get into some more predictions for 2025. Seeing your list, there's a wide variety of thoughts there. One of them you suggested relates to Greenfield sites where we're going to be growing our population.
Exactly. So if you look at public policy developments and announcements, there's a lot about doubling down on medium density housing, on infill housing. We want to double down on build to rent. We want to make sure that we live in denser cities. It's from an urban planning perspective, the exactly right policies. They got my full backing, but that's not what we will see. The main game in town in 2025 will be greenfield development sites on the outskirts of town. There are two reasons. The first one is we'll see a bucket load of population growth. And this population growth needs to be housed right now, obviously. Cost. Good old simple costs. It is significantly cheaper to build housing on the outskirts of town, bulldoze a bit of valuable farmland, slap a cheap box on top. That is the cheapest and fastest way of building housing.
And if we want to build to the scale that the government is expecting, 1.2 million dwellings over 5 years, and we know that's a pretty unrealistic scale, it's too hard and too expensive to do if you've got expensive land in the middle of the city, expensive construction costs, cranes and unions involved.
And it is the construction costs, which is of course linked to available material, available technology, available workers, absolutely correct. But the idea is if a square meter of housing on the outskirts of town costs about a third of building a square meter of housing in the center of town, and all the while you have this massive pressure for new housing, what housing will be built is pretty obvious. And so it is the decade of the greenfield sites, even though the policy settings are doing the exact opposite. But as long as the price realities of building, of construction don't react, it'll only get you so far.
Well, more Australians are prepared to trade backyards for balconies and courtyards to be in the right location, but cost is going to remain a major factor because interest rates are going to stay higher for longer than most of us would like. The cost of new construction is going to be more expensive. So they're going to get their backyards. They're just going to have to live a bit further out, Simon.
Exactly. And in the short term, that'll lead to fun developments like certain cities that have more land available on the outskirts of town, they simply can provide more cheaper housing. And therefore, they will look like much more affordable and cheaper cities, which is why I'm predicting that Melbourne will be the most affordable capital city by the end of the year. That's a tight one, to be honest, with the timing. This might only be something for 2026, but hey, well, we'll throw it in there. The logic is clear, isn't it? We go, Melbourne has no physical boundaries surrounding it. So there is endless flat land available that you can quickly bulldoze and you develop communities on top. Whereas even Sydney now already hit the Blue Mountains. So Sydney has to go up. And going up, yes, ensures that ultimately you need fewer kilometers of infrastructure for each citizen on average. That's fun and games. But ultimately it means that Sydney's house prices must go up because construction is up. Because going up is more expensive than going wide. That, of course, leads for a city like Melbourne in the long term to certain kind of problems, like how do we move all those people around? Well, the answer is probably on roads rather than rails, because that's much more slower to develop. It's more expensive. The state remains broke in 2025. Easy forecast there as well.
Well, Simon, that's a really interesting topic. So I'd like to discuss that with you in a future podcast about about cars, how we're going to drive, where we're going to drive. Are we going to have driverless cars? Are our roads going to cope? And I know both you and I like our cars. So can we discuss that in a topic, in a podcast coming up soon?
Absolutely. Let's dissect cars in great detail.
Okay, so one of your forecasts is Greenfield sites will dominate, and that's interesting compared to what our governments, our politicians, our urban planners would like. Another of your forecasts relates to who we are, how we are, the share of people born overseas.
Absolutely. So we will become more multicultural in Australia. We have just under a third of us having been born overseas, which is astonishingly high on an international level. We're doing really well in integrating people into society, and this is the easiest, it's almost a cheat code of a forecast, because 2/3 of population growth comes from overseas, only 1/3 is homegrown. And since this simple maths, a bit of maths, we will continue to become more multicultural. This will go on forever, essentially.
Well, it's got its benefits. I know there are some detractors to that, but we've discussed migration, the importance of it and how it's grown our country. So if you're interested in that, go back to one of the previous podcasts and hear Simon's thoughts on that. Simon, we also spent time talking about one of your other forecasts about Australia becoming an older nation.
Also a very easy forecast. Our longevity, our life expectancy goes up. So that's nice. That's a very, very good development. We get older and older. So nice. We get richer. That also means we can afford more healthcare. That means we can actually live longer. And particularly the aging cohort of tomorrow are baby boomers. And so the next people to reach the growing old stages are the richest cohort that has ever lived in Australia, and they will spend at least part of their wealth on extending their life. So we will get older. That also means, though, that all those societal challenges that come with aging will intensify. So that means, how do we provide care? Where do we provide care? All this thing will go up. If you are into, estimating market sizes, anything that smells like aged care will go up in price. Any kind of aged care business, any kind of aged care service provider should have a very strong year ahead. Or decades, really. But that's a very simple forecast, and I'm very confident about this, so to speak.
As you say, that's almost cheating to bring that one in, but that's okay. We like to get some easy kicks and some free kicks, as I say. You also had another thought about age-dependent home ownership rates. What was that? What was that forecast?
Yeah, so this is a two-pronged forecast. So what we will be seeing over the next year, most likely, is that the overall home ownership rate will go up. And that's simply because we take the biggest generation, millennials, and bit by bit move them from the renting stage of the life cycle to the home ownership stage of the life cycle. And so that, of course, makes home ownership go up. And so by simply looking at the home ownership rate, you might be fooled comparing this towards last year at the end of 2025. You go like, we made housing more affordable because more people own or live in a house that they own or have a mortgage on. But what we really need to look at is age-dependent home ownership rates. So we look at what was the propensity of a 30-year-old to own a house in 2025 and what was this 20, 30, 40 years ago. And this rate continues to lower and lower and lower for every stage of the life cycle.
So people are moving into home ownership later in life. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And fewer of them enter this at all. But overall, we enter it later in life. So at every point of the life cycle that we look at, slightly smaller share of people will own their home than they've done last year, than they've done 10, 20 years ago. That, of course, means more renters. That, of course, means more people need a rental property. So this would be a time in history where we would want more landlords in a system who provide housing to those people who desperately need it. And you then go, well, how do we create those landlords as a country? One way is to establish more build-to-rent schemes where a big institution provides rentals. That's cool. It's definitely helping. But is this enough? Or should we encourage more mom and dad type landlords to own a house? What are the right settings of us encouraging more landlords, all the while not ensure that it is just the landlords who get all the benefits of future house price growth and further exacerbate the problem of relatively low age-dependent home ownership rates. So you see, this is, of course, and you discuss this in your podcast on a weekly basis. This is a very, very tricky thing to get right, but it's also an easy thing to point the fingers in a very accusing but ultimately nonsensical way as well.
Now, Simon, I already put you on notice I'd like you to do a show on cars, but I know you've also made a couple of predictions for 2025. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. So give us a couple of predictions about cars and we'll dig into it much deeper in the specific show, Simon.
Yeah, so the first forecast here has to do with electric vehicles. At the moment, just over 1% of our national vehicle fleet is electric, and that share will go up because ultimately EVs make up an ever higher share of vehicle sales. That has to do with, of course, the market increasingly being introduced to more cheap Chinese electric vehicles, your BYDs and so forth. They drive down prices. We see also the top end of the market increasingly being comfortable with the likes of a Tesla and so forth. Bit by bit, we will be introducing more infrastructure, meaning chargeable infrastructure to make range anxiety go away, even though we know that vast majority of trips are short trips where just recharging at home is enough. And of course, battery technology improves. It's crazy what is coming out of China in terms of ever more efficient batteries. So this is definitely going to be all in the favor of EVs in the coming years, which probably already leads to the next and probably counterintuitive forecast about us selling definitely more cars in 2025 than we did in 2024.
Really? Why do you say that?
Well, couple of things. We move ever more millennials from their inner city, cyclable, walkable, trammable communities to the urban fringe because millennials make babies and look for family-sized homes. So we take bit by bit the biggest generation in Australia from the least car-dependent time of the life cycle to the most car-dependent time of the life cycle, the family stage. We also put them at the same time from the most car-independent geography of the city to the most car-dependent geography of the city. So all of that pushes it this way. Also, the people that are actually pushing into the mid-80s, early 80s, where they stop driving, is relatively small because the big boomers are too young yet to give up driving. So we have very few people giving up driving, ever more people moving into the high car ownership stages. And of course, people that forwent a new car purchase over the last couple of years will eventually be pushed into buying one. And so I think all of this comes together over the next couple of years. So I'm very confident that we will see more car sales in 25 than we saw in 24.
Okay, well, we're going on record, so it'll be interesting to see at the end of next year how many of these were right. So far, I can see that most of those are being based on demographics. And as you often say, that's as good close as you can get to a crystal ball, because if you know how many millennials are going to eventually move into family formation stage, if you know how many baby boomers are going to move to the next stage of their life, this makes it very easy. And this is why I know a lot of businesses enjoy having you give information to them in their conferences. You help businesses, industries, institutions and governments. That's what you do at the demographics group, isn't it?
Exactly, that's what I do, always with a smile, because it's so much fun to particularly download and analyze data specific to this group of clients that I'm speaking to. Because this demographic data that we do here, we tend to talk about it on a national broad level, but you can hone into it in great detail. And we can do this because we have fantastic data in Australia, much better data than anywhere in Australia, anywhere in Europe or even the US, I would argue. Our census, our ABS are fantastic in helping us to be able to make data-based decisions in our businesses, in our NGOs, in our governments. So at least theoretically we can do it. We don't really have any excuse to not be a truly data-driven economy in Australia.
Well, I'll leave a link to the demographics group in the show notes, so if people would like to have you present to their organisation and get insights to give them an unfair advantage, why not take advantage of Simon? Now, I know you're also going to be speaking at Wealth Retreat to our small group of high net worth clients that are going to be at Wealth Retreat at the end of early May on the Gold Coast. And you've been, I remember in the last few years, receiving standing ovations. You're an outstanding speaker where people got great insights to property and to their investments. Now, you don't usually make many property predictions, but you use demographics to explain what you think is going to move ahead in property. But you have got one property forecast for 2025, Simon.
I'm very optimistic that working from home will remain popular, but it will particularly be popular in Melbourne. Melbourne will be forever the working from home capital in Australia. What I mean by this is, we discussed it already a bit. We push millennials as they start making their babies, from the inner city to the urban fringe. In Melbourne in particular, the urban fringe is further away from the office towers than anywhere else. So the motivation of those millennials to go to the office shrinks by every kilometer that they move further out. We then have to ask ourselves, what will the millennials do? Well, they will fight tooth and nail to go back to the office, so they will work remotely, which is just as well. And in Victoria, nobody will force them back to the office, especially not the government, because they know you better work from home and don't put all that much pressure on our very, very underserviced road and rail network. So please just stay at home and work remotely. That is the Melbourne narrative. The general narrative is true elsewhere, where we put millennials, the biggest cohort, far away from the office towers. So that ultimately means, yeah, we will have a keen sense of wanting to work from home, but not in every city will this lead to more people, the working from home rate being elevated, because there is the pressure to put people back into the office. Part of this is just a power play from the bosses who simply don't trust their workers enough to work remotely. But part of this is real hard data, hard insight, that a team is better served if they at least spend some regular time all together as a team in the same office, in the same space. And so we will be seeing that trend develop. But ultimately, I think it's too easy to say, this is the year where everyone returns to the office. That's not what it is. Working from home remains very, very popular. And of course, we discussed in the past, a couple of minutes ago, unemployment is low. That means the power with workers is high. So they get to call a bit more the shots than some people might.
Well, the work from home, or the hybrid method really, so it's a combination, is also going to change the sort of accommodation one requires. Working from the kitchen table and having the cats walk through, or the Zoom call, isn't acceptable anymore, is it?
No, if you work remotely for longer, it is now increasingly becoming a requirement by employers to have a decent working setup. So if you don't have the space to do this, you go back home. So there is also a demographic driver in there that ensures that working from home will eventually soften on the urban fringe. Not for now, though. For now, the millennials, as they move to the urban fringe, they move there with one kid. So mom and dad move into one bedroom. One kid, one bedroom, and you have a spare bedroom for a study. As you add your second kid, and not every household will add a second kid, but some will, these households eventually need to make a decision. Do I not give each kid their own bedroom, or do I give up the study to make room for a bedroom for the kid? And then some of those workers, again, not all, but some of those workers will say, okay, each kid gets their own bedroom, and I commute to the office. And so all of a sudden, we have a future push away from working from home into the office. But that's not yet the case because overwhelmingly millennials are just getting started with their baby making. And the amount of millennials where both kids are so old that they both need their own bedroom is relatively small. So we still get away for a couple more years with millennials doing away with a 3-bedroom house in their ideal setup. Eventually they'll shift. And eventually, millennials will want a spare bedroom for each kid, and then they will happily return to the office. But also then the kids are old enough to happily have them entertain themselves a bit more and so forth. They're parked at school for longer stints of the day rather than short kindy trips, or maybe you are not at kindergarten at your early years and so forth. So that'll shift in the long term. But for now, working from home, still a big thing.
Simon, you also had a prediction for the coming year about Melbourne and how it will sit in the hierarchy of affordability.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that pressures in Melbourne in the short term suggest that it will get more and more affordable in relative terms to the other capital
It won't
cities.
be affordable, but compared to other capitals.
Exactly. We need to be very careful about the word affordable in the context of housing here, because affordability is a relative term. But so the idea is that we look at these cities as they are operating right now, and we look at which cities can add what type of housing stock. And Melbourne is absolutely beautifully placed to add more of the cheapest and fastest housing type, for better or worse. And this is Greenfield developed single family separate homes type product. Costs about a third per square meter of building in the medium high density region of the city. And so if a city can add heaps more of the cheapest and fastest housing stock, not only will Melbourne definitely be the fastest growing city, it will also turn into the biggest and the most affordable city within the next 5 to 6 years. And I would say that by the end of 2025, there is a really good chance that Melbourne already takes over the prize of being the most affordable capital city in Australia.
Well, it also means that Melbourne is going to revert to the mean in due course, and there's a great window of opportunity for those who, not that I'm suggesting try and time the market, but if you're going to buy in the Melbourne market anyway, do it counter-cyclically and take advantage of it, because I've never seen the differential between Melbourne and the other capital cities as big as this. Now, one more trend I'd like to discuss today, and then next week we're going to come back in with the third of the three episodes on the trends for 2025. But tourism, as you often say, Australia's economy is dependent upon four things. We dig things out of the ground and we sell them overseas, our minerals. We grow things in the ground and sell them overseas. And that's the food that so many of the Asian neighbours require. We have an education system, and we spoke last week about what's going to happen with international students, and that is a very big industry. But tourism is another industry that I can't see AI, artificial intelligence, or computers or robots taking over.
Absolutely not. Tourism is the most human dependent industry because what we're selling is a genuine experience of Australia. And so we do need Australians to do this in Australia. Also, you're not going to have a tourism experience outside of Australia and we make money with it. Doesn't make sense. So tourism numbers, though, they will finally recover in 2025. So that's tourists in terms of persons, headcount. Technically speaking, the dollar tourism recovery already occurred last year, but of course there's a lot of inflation in the mix there, so you can kind of forget about this. This figure, the per capita spend of tourists went up, But that's, of course, simply the reason since we lost the lower income tourists and the middle income tourists as well.
So you're suggesting, Simon, that we're not getting the cheaper tourists, and I'm not saying that rudely, but the backpackers and the ones who haven't got as much money to spend.
We got some of them already back, actually. So the backpacker experience wasn't too bad. We recovered lots of them back. They are, of course, an interesting cohort since they are long-term visitors. And for them, the forbiddingly high price of a flight to Australia wasn't as much of an issue because they spent 12 months here or longer. But the tourists that I was talking about were those relatively low budget tourists for whom the price of the ticket here makes up such a big chunk. These tourists then just looked at cheaper tickets and went to cheaper destinations. And now, since recovery goes up a bit around the world, and of course some people have Australia on their bucket list for a once-of-a-lifetime trip, more of those people will return to Australia. All the tourism forecasters, not just me forecasting this, say 2025 we will supersede the pre-pandemic tourism levels, which is a good development. But some of the tourism regions are actually quite nervous about this since they ran out of staff. And while they've run out of staff already, and they said, it's nice, whatever, it's for tourists to be back. And we could, of course, accommodate more visitors had we more staff. But you can only service so many people if you have that many people working for you in your hotel, in your kayaking business, in whatever it is. That becomes difficult. So the workforce challenges for tourism will be big because the recovery is absolutely guaranteed to be completed.
Well, we've got some close friends who live in Broome and they have real difficulty getting staff for their retail outlets because A, it's a distant location, and B, rents in those areas are very expensive and hard to come by. There's very little accommodation. They've actually had to rent out a couple of places themselves to put the staff in to provide accommodation to get people to come.
Absolutely. It is the cornerstone problem for many regions is staff accommodation, particularly when you need low income staff. If you need a surgeon, whatever, they'll find a house at the price point. That's cool. But if your business, and tourism is a prime example, if you need low-income workers to man your restaurant, your hotel, your retail outlets, you need low-income accommodation somewhere, somehow. And quite often the employers know that the free market isn't providing it, and then the employers, like the titans of industry in the olden days, when the factory owner needed to build a village next to the factory, they are now providing staff accommodation in our tourist towns around the country.
It was a fascinating group of predictions. This is the second of 3 episodes, and I'm keen to chat next week with the last of your thoughts for 2025. But I think putting it all together, there's going to be interesting times, political challenges, money problems, but we're going to have a good year ahead. I'm looking forward to 2025, Simon.
Definitely. It's going to be an exciting year. A lot of change geopolitically speaking. So at least, at the very least, it's going to be an exciting year. But ultimately, I do think, and we discussed this in the past, we will definitely run more geopolitical sessions in the future. Australia is well positioned to weather any type of storm. So please remain bold and confident in Australia.
I think that's a great idea. Look forward to catching up with you again next week, Simon.
I'll see you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.